In 1940,
more guns,
France had
and
more men,
tanks
more
than Nazi
guns,
Germany.
and more tanks
Its
than
military
Nazi
was
Germany.
larger, better equipped,
Its military
and
was
backed by
larger,
the full
better
might of the
equipped,
British
and backed
Empire.
by the full might of the British
So how
Empire.
did it fall in just 46
So
days?
how did it fall in just
How did the
46
army that
days?
once stood victorious in
How did the
1918
army that once stood
crumble
victorious
so
in
quickly that even the Germans were stunned by
1918
their own
crumble so
success?
quickly that even the
This
Germans
isn't
were
just a
stunned
story
by
of
their own
blitzkrieg
success?
and bold plans.
This
It is
isn't
a
just a
story of
story of
assumptions,
blitzkrieg and bold
hesitation,
plans.
poor
It is a
coordination,
story of assumptions,
and a nation already
hesitation,
broken
poor
before the first shot
coordination,
was fired.
and a nation already
The
broken
fall of
before the
France
first
wasn't
shot
just
was
a
fired.
military collapse.
The
It
fall
was a
of France
psychological,
wasn't just a
political,
military
and
collapse.
civilizational shock.
It
One
was a
that still raises
psychological,
hard questions
political,
today.
and civilizational
In 1940,
shock,
France
one
had
that
more
still
men,
raises
more
hard
guns,
questions today.
and more tanks than Nazi
On September
Germany.
1st,
Its military was larger, better
1939,
equipped,
Germany
and backed by the
invaded
full might
Poland.
of the British
Britain
Empire.
and France, bound by
So how did
treaty,
it fall in
declared
just
war
46
2 days
days?
later.
How
But
did the
on the
army
Western
that once
Front,
stood
little
victorious
happened.
in 1918
Soldiers dug in.
crumble so quickly
Guns
that
stayed
even
silent,
the Germans were
and the
stunned
world
by their
began
own
to
success.
speak of a funny war.
This isn't just a story
Behind the
of
lines,
blitzkrieg
however,
and bold
Adolf
plans.
Hitler was preparing
It is
for
a story
something
of
very real.
assumptions, hesitation,
By the autumn
poor
of
coordination, and a nation
1939,
already broken
Germany
before
had
the first
crushed
shot was
Poland,
fired.
aided by the Soviet Union,
The fall of France
and now
wasn't
turned
just
its
a
eyes
military
westward.
collapse.
Hitler
It
knew
was a
his pact with
psychological,
Stalin might
political,
not
and
last.
civilizational shock.
He also
One that
feared
still
Britain
raises
and
hard
France would
questions
rearm
today.
quickly.
The original
Time,
German
he
plan,
believed,
the
was not
Manstein
on
plan,
Germany's side.
resembled the old
So he
Schlieffen
did what
strategy.
few expected.
Sweep through
He
Belgium
ordered an
and the
attack on
Netherlands,
France
pin
within
the
a month.
Allies, and punch through
His
in the
generals
north.
were aghast.
But Hitler
Many
wasn't
believed it would be
satisfied.
a repeat of
He
the
feared that
carnage
such a
of
move would be too predictable, and France
1914,
too
a
ready.
bloodbath. France
Instead,
was strong.
Hitler,
Its
inspired
defenses,
by General
especially the
Erich von
famed
Manstein,
Maginot Line,
though
were
unaware of his
formidable.
parallel thinking,
On paper,
embraced
the
a
Allies
daring
had the
alternative.
advantage.
The heart of the plan was
3.7
this.
million men,
Army Group B
14,
would attack through
zero
the Low
guns.
Countries and draw
3,
Allied forces
700
north.
tanks.
Meanwhile,
3,
Army Group
0
A,
aircraft.
including most of the panzers,
Germany, in
would
contrast,
drive through
had
the Ardennes forest,
2.8
considered
million men,
impassable by tanks,
7,
and break through at
500
Sedan,
guns,
crossing the Meuse River.
2, 700
From there,
tanks,
the armored columns would
4,
race west to
0
Abbeville,
aircraft.
cutting off the Allied
And of
forces
those
in Belgium
157
from the rest
German
of France.
divisions, only
It was a
16 were
high-risk
motorized.
maneuver. The
Their
roads in
panzers
the
were
Ardennes
fast,
were narrow
but limited,
and choked.
and their air
The
superiority,
advancing armor
though
would be
potent,
vulnerable to air
wasn't
attack.
guaranteed.
Their flanks would be
So
exposed.
what happened?
And the
The
entire
original German
operation
plan,
hinged
the
on
Manstein
speed,
plan,
surprise,
resembled the
and
old
boldness.
Schlieffen strategy.
Even General
Sweep
Fedor
through
von
Belgium
Bock,
and the
commander
Netherlands,
of Army
pin the
Group B,
Allies, and punch
warned,
through in the north.
"You are cramming the mass
But
of
Hitler
tank
wasn't
units together
satisfied.
into the sparse
He feared
roads
that
of the
such a
Ardennes,
move would be
as
too
if there were no
predictable
such
and
thing
France
as air
too
power,
ready.
and you hoped to lead
Instead,
an operation
Hitler,
to the
inspired
coast
by
with an
General
open
Erich
southern
von
flank.
Manstein, though
But
unaware
Hitler
of his
pushed
parallel
forward,
thinking,
and the
embraced
Allies
a
played
daring
into his
alternative.
hands. The French
The
and
heart of the
British
plan was
expected
this.
a German attack,
Army Group
and they
B would
expected
attack
it to
through the
come
Low
Belgium.
Countries and draw
Their
Allied
plan,
forces north.
known as Plan D,
Meanwhile,
called for rapid
Army
movement
Group A,
into the Low
including
Countries.
most of the panzers,
The
would
best
drive
French
through the
divisions,
Ardennes
along
forest,
with the
considered
British
impassable
Expeditionary
by
Force,
tanks, and break through
BEF,
at Sedan,
would move
crossing
to the
the
Dial
Meuse
River
River.
and try to halt
From
the German
there,
advance
the armored
there.
columns would race west
But the
to
plan was
Abbeville,
deeply
cutting
flawed.
off the Allied
The
forces in
Belgians and
Belgium
Dutch,
from the
trying
rest
to
of France.
maintain neutrality,
It was a
refused
high-risk
to coordinate
maneuver.
closely
The
with
roads in
Allied
the
forces.
Ardennes were narrow and
The
choked.
Ardennes,
The advancing
considered
armor
unsuitable
would be
for
vulnerable
mechanized
to air
warfare,
attack.
was
Their
left
flanks
lightly
would be
defended.
exposed.
There was no
And
strategic
the entire
reserve.
operation hinged
France
on
committed
speed,
all its best
surprise,
mobile
and
units
boldness.
forward, leaving
Even
nothing
General
to counter
Fedor
a
von
deep
Bock,
breakthrough.
commander of Army
Warnings
Group B,
came.
warned,
French intelligence
"You are
flagged
cramming
German
the mass
activity
of
in the
tank
Ardennes.
units together into the sparse roads
Officers
of
in
the
the field
Ardennes
asked
as
for
if there were no
reinforcements,
such thing as air power,
but the High
and you
Command
hoped
did
to lead an
nothing.
operation to
Even
the coast
when, in
with
January
an open southern
1940,
flank."
a German aircraft
But
carrying
Hitler
attack plans
pushed
crashed
forward,
in Belgium,
and the
prompting
Allies
changes
played
to German
into his
deployment.
hands.
The French
The
did
French
not
and British
reconsider their
expected a German
assumptions.
attack, and they
The
expected it to
Germans
come through
kept
Belgium.
refining their plan.
Their plan,
The Allies
known
kept
as
marching
Plan
toward the
D,
decoy.
called for
On May
rapid
10th,
movement
the
into
storm
the Low
broke.
Countries.
Germany launched
The best
Case
French
Yellow,
divisions,
its western
along with the
campaign,
British
with
Expeditionary
simultaneous
Force,
invasions
BEF,
of Belgium,
would move to
the
the Dial
Netherlands,
River
and
try to
Luxembourg.
halt the German
In
advance
the
there.
north, airborne
But the
troops in
plan
Dutch
was deeply
platforms,
flawed.
seized bridges and airfields.
The Belgians and
Though many
Dutch,
Dutch
trying
units
to
fought
maintain
hard,
neutrality,
the Luftwaffe
refused to
bombed
coordinate
Rotterdam on May
closely
14th,
with Allied
killing
forces.
800 civilians
The
and
Ardennes,
triggering Dutch
considered
surrender.
unsuitable for
The Belgian
mechanized
fortress
warfare,
of
was left
Eventual,
lightly defended.
thought impregnable,
There was
fell
no
to
strategic
glider-borne
reserve.
troops In one
France
of the most
committed
daring
all its
raids
best
of the
mobile
war,
units forward,
refugees
leaving nothing
clogged
to
the
counter a
roads.
deep breakthrough.
Allied troops,
Warnings
advancing
came.
to the
French
DE
intelligence
line,
flagged
found
German
themselves
activity in the
slowed
Ardennes.
and disorganized.
Officers in the field asked
In
for
the Ardennes,
reinforcements,
the panzers rolled.
but the High Command
Though
did nothing.
blocked briefly by
Even
destroyed
when,
bridges
in
and
January
traffic jams, some up to
1940,
250
a German
kilometers
aircraft
long,
carrying attack
the German
plans
advance
crashed in
surged
Belgium,
forward
prompting
with
changes to
astonishing
German
speed.
deployment. The
On May
French
12th,
did not reconsider
tanks
their
under
assumptions.
Rommel and Guderian reached
The Germans
Meuse.
kept refining their
By
plan.
the 13th, they began
The Allies
crossing.
kept marching toward
French
the decoy.
units collapsed.
On
Some
May
fled
10th,
without
the
firing
storm
a shot.
broke.
Rumors
Germany
spread
launched
that the Germans
Case
were already behind
its
them.
Western campaign,
Panic set
with
in.
simultaneous
A captured
invasions
French
of
general
Belgium,
admitted,
the Netherlands,
"You are much
and
too
Luxembourg.
fast. Much too fast
In the
for
north,
us."
airborne
As
troops
Case
in
Red
Dutch
began, the
uniforms
Germans
seized
unleashed their
bridges
full
and
might.
airfields.
With twice the number
Though
of
many
divisions
Dutch
as
units
the Allies
fought
now
hard,
fielded,
the
they
Luftwaffe
moved
bombed
with
Rotterdam
overwhelming
on May
momentum.
14th,
French
killing
commanders tried
800
a new
civilians
tactic,
and
building
triggering Dutch
fortified
surrender.
strongpoints in villages
The
and
Belgian
woods,
fortress of
so-called
Eben
hedgehogs,
Mil, thought
to delay
impregnable,
German infantry
fell to
while reserving
glider-borne
mobile
troops in
units
one
for
of the most
counterattacks.
daring raids of the war.
At first, it worked.
Refugees
General
clogged the
Louva, watching
roads.
his infantry
Allied
fail to
troops,
clear a
advancing
French-held
to the
village,
Dial line,
noted
found
in
themselves
frustration.
slowed and
The
disorganized.
tanks drive through,
In the
but
Ardennes,
the French lay
the
low.
panzers rolled.
When our infantry
Though
tries
blocked
to
briefly
follow,
by
they're
destroyed
torn
bridges
apart.
and traffic jams, some up
But
to
this delay could
250
not
kilometers
last.
long,
On
the
June
German
6th,
advance
the
surged
Germans broke
forward
through
with
the Somme
astonishing
defenses
speed.
at Péronne and Amiens.
On May 12th,
And then further
tanks under
south
Rommel
at
and
Pont
Guderian
Saint-Maxence.
reached the Meuse.
French units,
By the 13th,
often
they began
understrength
crossing.
and undersupplied, were
French
simply
units
outmatched.
collapsed. Some fled without
On
firing
the
a
17th,
shot.
German
Rumors
panzers
spread that
reached
the Germans
Forges-les-Eaux,
were already
splitting
behind
the French
them.
10th
Panic set
Army.
in.
The breakthrough
captured
forced
French
yet another
general
Allied
admitted,
retreat.
The
Some
German
units
crossing
didn't
of the
even try
Meuse
to
River
fight.
at Sedan
At
was the
Entrepierre,
decisive moment
French
of the
tanks
campaign.
abandoned their
The
vehicles
river,
without
flanked by
resistance.
hills and fortified
In
French
other sectors,
positions, should
German
have been a
infantry
bulwark.
met only scattered or
Instead, it
demoralized
became
defenders,
a doorway.
but not all
The
surrendered.
Luftwaffe launched
At
an
the Abbeville
unprecedented
bridgehead,
aerial
on May
assault,
27th,
hundreds of sorties
French
over
and
a
British
narrow
forces
stretch of the
under
French
General
line.
de Gaulle
The defenders,
counterattacked.
shaken by the bombardment
BB-1
and
BAS
lacking
tanks,
adequate
slow
anti-aircraft
but heavily
support,
armored,
faltered.
caused German
Some
units
French
to
soldiers
panic.
abandoned their posts
Yet,
entirely.
despite moments of
Others
heroism,
simply froze.
French counterattacks
The German
were
engineers
piecemeal,
built pontoon bridges
uncoordinated,
under fire.
and quickly
By nightfall
overcome
on May
by German
13th,
88
tanks were already
millimeter
rumbling
guns,
across.
repurposed as anti-tank
The French
weapons.
commanders
On June
had no
10th,
strategic
Italy
reserve
declared
to
war
seal
on
the
France,
breach.
sensing
They
an
had no
opportunity
plan
for
for a
easy gains.
counteroffensive.
Yet,
And
when
most
Mussolini's
damning of
troops
all,
attacked in
they
the Alps,
refused to
they
believe
were
what
stopped
was
cold
happening.
by only 6 French
In
divisions.
Paris, General
Italy's
Maurice
contribution to
Gamelin,
the fall of
commander-in-chief
France
of
was
the French
symbolic,
army, was
not
paralyzed.
strategic.
He had no
Meanwhile,
modern
the Germans
command
entered
infrastructure,
Paris on June
no
14th.
wireless link to frontline
There was
units,
no last
and no
stand,
ability to
no
respond in real
barricades,
time.
no defense
By
of
the
the
time
capital.
he ordered
The French
countermeasures,
government
the Germans had already
fled
moved
south.
miles beyond the Meuse.
In the countryside,
On
French
May
units
15th,
continued fighting,
Gamelin finally
but
ordered a
without
retreat from the
coordination,
Dial line in
often
Belgium,
unaware of the
but it was
broader
too
picture.
late. The panzers
Entire
were racing
regiments
toward the
lost
coast,
cohesion.
threatening to encircle the
Officers
entire
gave
Allied
conflicting
force in the
orders.
north.
Soldiers
Meanwhile,
wandered into
in
German
Britain,
lines,
Prime Minister
dazed and
Neville
disoriented.
Chamberlain resigned.
A French staff officer
His replacement,
wrote,
Winston
"It's not even a
Churchill,
question of
immediately
morale.
found himself
They
facing
don't
the
know what's
prospect of
happening.
catastrophe.
They're stunned.
France was
The
collapsing.
sight of an
The
airplane
best Allied
terrifies
armies
them.
were now at risk
German
of
soldiers
encirclement.
encountered villages where
And the
French
question
troops
was
had
no longer
surrendered
how to
days
win the
earlier
war,
without a shot.
but how
Entire
to survive
columns
it.
stood abandoned.
On May
Tanks
20th,
out of fuel,
the German
cannons
2nd
without
Panzer
crews,
Division reached
uniforms
Abbeville
discarded.
on the English Channel.
In some sectors, however,
The Allies were
resistance
now
continued,
split in two.
and the Germans
In the north,
responded with
the
brutality.
British Expeditionary
In multiple
Force,
locations
much of the French
across
First
northern
Army,
and central
the Belgian
France,
army, nearly
German
1
SS
million men
units
were
and
trapped.
Waffen SS divisions
In the south,
committed war
the
crimes.
disorganized remnants
More
of the
than
French army,
3,000
still
African
reeling
colonial
from the breach at
soldiers were
Sedan.
executed. Even
Germans
after
marveled
surrendering,
at what they
German
found.
officers often justified
Alexander
their actions with
Stahlberg,
vile
a German
racial
officer,
ideology.
wrote,
One
"The
German
streets were
commander
lined
told a
with the
French
wreckage of a
officer,
defeated
"An
French army,
inferior race
a
does not
never-ending
deserve
chain
to
of
fight
destruction."
such a civilizing race
Incredibly,
as the German race."
the Germans paused.
In Wagram,
Both Hitler and his
Erquinvillers,
generals feared
and
a
Lekenoy,
counterattack from the
massacres
south.
of prisoners
The panzers
and
had
civilians
raced
occurred.
far ahead of their
At
infantry
times,
and risked
French
being
women
cut
and
off.
children were executed
At
alongside
Arras, on May
soldiers.
20,
The Wehrmacht
British and
looked
French
the other
tanks
way.
launched a
The
bold but
narrative
ultimately
of a clean
isolated
blitzkrieg was
counterattack.
already forming.
It caused
But for
panic
the
among some
victims,
German
it was
commanders,
genocide by
but
another
without
name. As
coordination
the
or
military front
reinforcement, it
collapsed,
failed to
the
achieve a
political
breakthrough.
crisis in Paris
As the
reached its
pocket
breaking
tightened,
point.
the Allies made
Premier
a fateful
Paul Reynaud
decision:
desperately sought
withdraw to the
options.
port of Dunkirk
He
and
requested
evacuate.
more British fighter
It
squadrons,
was a desperate
but
move.
got only
The
4.
port was vulnerable to
He
air
asked
attack.
President
The
Roosevelt
roads
for
were
aid.
jammed. the
and
water
received
shallow,
sympathy,
and the
but no
Luftwaffe
material
had
support.
total freedom over the
He
skies.
proposed a union of France
But they
and
had
Britain,
one advantage.
a shared
The Germans
citizenship
hesitated.
and war cabinet.
At General von
continue the fight.
Rundstedt's request,
The
Hitler
response
ordered a
from the French
temporary
cabinet
halt of the
was
Panzer
hostile.
advance on May
Marshal
24th.
Philippe Pétain,
Historians
the
still
aged
debate why.
World War I
Some
hero,
say Hitler hoped
called
to
it a
negotiate
marriage
with
with a
Britain.
corpse. He
Others
saw the
argue he
proposal
wanted
as
the
a British
infantry to
ploy
catch
to
up.
seize French
Still
colonies.
others say it was
He
a
wasn't
misjudgment
alone.
born of
The government
overconfidence.
fractured.
Whatever the
On June
reason,
16th,
it bought
Reynaud
the Allies
resigned.
time.
Pétain took his
Operation
place and
Dynamo
immediately sought an
began on
armistice
May
with Germany.
26th.
On June
Over the next
22nd,
9 days,
1940,
hundreds of
France
naval
signed an
vessels,
armistice with
warships,
Germany
fishing boats,
in the very
merchant
same
ships
railway
ferried
carriage
troops
at
across the
Compiègne,
English Channel.
where Germany had surrendered
Some
in
men swam out to
1918.
waiting boats.
Hitler
Others
sat
waited in long
stone-faced
lines under
as General
relentless
Wilhelm
bombing.
Keitel read the
Quartermaster Frank Harold
terms.
recalled,
France would be divided.
"There were about
Two-thirds
30 of us
occupied
in
by
the water.
Germany.
I could
The
only
remainder
doggy paddle
controlled by
because
the
of
new
my
Vichy
wounded leg,
regime under
but I
Pétain,
trod water
who
and
would
got back to the
collaborate with
beach
the
to wait for my
Nazis.
chance again."
Over 2 million French
Rearguard
soldiers were
actions
taken
by
prisoner.
French and British units held off the
30,000
Germans.
civilians were dead.
By June
France had
4th,
lost not only the war, but its
193,000
soul.
British
The
and
German crossing of the Meuse
145,000
River
French
at
troops
Sedan
had
was the
escaped.
decisive moment of the
But
campaign.
88,000, mostly
river,
French soldiers
flanked
covering
by
the
hills
withdrawal,
and
were
fortified
captured.
French positions
And
should have
then
been
another
a bulwark.
blow.
Instead,
Belgium surrendered
it
on
became
May
a doorway.
28th, unilaterally.
The Luftwaffe launched
King
an
Leopold
unprecedented
III,
aerial
without
assault.
consulting the Allies,
Hundreds of sorties
gave himself
over a
up
narrow
to the
stretch
Germans
of the
and
French
became
line.
their prisoner.
The defenders,
The Allies
shaken
were
by the
stunned.
bombardment and lacking
French Premier
adequate
Paul Reynaud
anti-aircraft
called
support,
him a pig.
faltered.
Former
Some
British
French
Prime Minister
soldiers
David
abandoned
Lloyd
their
George
posts
called his
entirely.
actions a
Others
sample
simply
of
froze.
perfidy and pusillanimity.
The German engineers
But even
built
with
pontoon
Dunkirk, the
bridges
war
under
in France
fire.
wasn't over.
By nightfall on May
It was
13th,
about to get
tanks
worse.
were already rumbling
With the
across.
north cleared, the Germans
French
turned their
commanders had
attention
no
to Case
strategic
Red,
reserve
the
to seal the
conquest of the
breach.
rest of
They
France.
had no plan for a
On June
counteroffensive.
5th, they
And
attacked.
most damning of all,
This time,
they refused
there
to
would be
believe
no
what was happening.
evacuation.
In Paris,
Army
General
Group B
Maurice
advanced
Gamelin,
toward the Seine.
commander-in-chief of the French
Army
army,
Group A,
was
with
paralyzed.
most of the panzers,
He had
smashed
no
through
modern
toward
command
Tours
infrastructure,
and the Loire
no
River.
wireless link to
Army
frontline
Group
units,
C assaulted
and no
the
ability
Maginot
to
Line,
respond in real
finally
time.
engaged after being
By the time he
bypassed in
ordered
the opening
countermeasures,
weeks.
the Germans had already
France had
moved
no time
miles
to
beyond the
regroup,
Meuse.
no reserves,
On
no
May
answer to the
15th,
speed and
Gamelin
aggression of the
finally
German
ordered
offensive.
a retreat from the Dyle line in
As
Belgium.
Case Red began,
But
the
it was
Germans
too late.
unleashed their full
The
might.
panzers were racing
With
toward
twice
the
the number
coast,
of divisions as
threatening
the
to
Allies
encircle
now
the entire
fielded,
Allied
they
force in
moved
the
with
north.
overwhelming momentum.
Meanwhile, in Britain, Prime
French
Minister
commanders
Neville
tried a
Chamberlain
new
resigned.
tactic, building
replacement,
fortified strong points
Winston
in
Churchill,
villages and woods,
immediately found
so-called
himself facing the
hedgehogs,
prospect of
to delay
catastrophe.
German infantry
France
while
was
reserving
collapsing.
mobile units
The
for
best
counterattacks.
Allied armies were now at risk
At
of
first,
encirclement.
it worked.
And the question was
General
no longer
Louva,
how
watching
to win
his
the war,
infantry fail to
but how
clear
to
a
survive
French-held
it.
village,
On May 20th,
noted in
the
frustration.
German 2nd Panzer Division
The tanks drive
reached
through,
Abbeville,
but the
on
French
English
lay low.
Channel.
When our infantry
The Allies
tries
were
to
now
follow,
split in
they're
two.
torn apart.
In the north,
But this
the
delay
British
could not
Expeditionary
last.
Force, much
On
of
June
the French
6th,
First
the
Army,
Germans
and the
broke
Belgian
through
Army,
the Somme defenses
nearly 1
at
million
Péronne
men,
and
were
Amiens,
trapped.
and then further south
In the
at
south,
Pont
the
Saint-Maxent.
disorganized remnants of the French
French
army,
units,
still
often
reeling from the
understrength and
breach at Sedan.
undersupplied, were simply
Germans
outmatched.
marveled at what they found.
On the 7th,
Alexander
German
Stahlberg,
panzers reached
a German
Forges-les-Eaux,
officer, wrote,
splitting the French 10th
"The
Army.
streets were
The
lined with the
breakthrough
wreckage
forced yet
of a
another
defeated
Allied
French
retreat.
army, a never-ending
Some units
chain
didn't
of
even try to
destruction.
fight. At Autrepierre,
Incredibly,
French
the
tanks
Germans
abandoned their
paused.
vehicles without
Both
resistance.
Hitler and his
In other
generals feared
sectors,
a
German
counterattack
infantry
from the
met
south.
only scattered or
The panzers
demoralized
had raced
defenders.
far ahead of their infantry
not all
and risked
surrendered.
being cut off.
At the
At
Abbeville
Arras,
bridgehead
on May
on May
21st,
27th,
British
French
and
and British
tanks
forces
launched
under
a
General
bold,
de Gaulle
but
counterattacked.
ultimately
Bone
isolated
his tanks slow but
counterattack
heavily armored caused
that
German
caused
units
panic
to panic.
among some German commanders.
Yet, despite moments
But
of
without
heroism,
coordination
French
or
counterattacks
reinforcement,
were piecemeal,
it failed to achieve a
uncoordinated,
breakthrough.
and quickly
As the pocket
overcome by
tightened,
German
the Allies made a
88mm
fateful
guns,
decision:
repurposed as
withdraw to the
anti-tank
port of
weapons.
Dunkirk and evacuate.
On June 10th,
It was a
Italy
desperate
declared
move.
war on
The
France,
port was
sensing an
vulnerable to
opportunity
air
for
attack.
easy
The
gains.
roads were
Yet,
jammed,
when
the
Mussolini's
water
troops
shallow,
attacked in
and
the
the
Alps,
Luftwaffe
they were
had
stopped
total
cold
freedom
by
over the
only
skies.
6 French divisions.
But they had one advantage.
Italy's
The Germans
contribution to the
hesitated.
fall of France
At
was
General
symbolic,
von Rundstedt's
not
request,
strategic.
Hitler ordered a
Meanwhile,
temporary
the
halt
Germans
of the
entered
Panzer
Paris
advance
on June
May
14.
24th.
There was
Historians
no
still
last
debate
stand,
why.
no
Some say
barricades,
Hitler hoped to
no
negotiate
defense
with
of the
Britain.
capital.
Others argue he
The
wanted
French
the
government
infantry
had
to catch
already
up.
fled south.
Still others say it was a
In the
misjudgment.
countryside, French
Born
units
of
continued
overconfidence.
fighting but without
Whatever the
coordination,
reason, it
often
bought the
unaware
Allies
of the
time.
broader picture. Entire regiments
Operation
lost
Dynamo
cohesion.
began on May
Officers
26th.
gave conflicting orders.
Over the next 9 days,
Soldiers
hundreds
wandered
of naval
into
vessels,
German lines,
warships,
dazed and
fishing
disoriented.
boats, merchant ships,
A French staff
ferried
officer
troops
wrote,
across the English Channel.
"It's not even a question
Some
of
men
morale.
swam out to
They
waiting
don't know
boats.
what's happening.
Others
They're
waited
stunned.
in long
The
lines
sight of an
under
airplane
relentless bombing.
terrifies them."
Quartermaster
German
Frank
soldiers
Harrell
encountered
recalled,
villages where
"There
French
were
troops
about
had
30 of
surrendered
us in the
days
water.
earlier without a
I
shot.
could only doggy
Entire
paddle because
columns
of my
stood
wounded
abandoned
leg,
tanks out of
but
fuel,
I trod
cannons
water
without
and got
crews,
back to the beach
uniforms
to wait for
discarded.
my chance again."
In some
Rearguard
sectors,
actions
however,
by French
resistance
and British
continued,
units held off
and the Germans
Germans.
responded with
By June
brutality.
4th,
In multiple
93,000
locations
British
across
and
northern and central
145,000
France,
French troops
German
had escaped.
SS units and
But
Waffen SS
88,000,
divisions
mostly
committed
French
war
soldiers
crimes.
covering the withdrawal,
More
were
than
captured.
3,000
And then
African
another
colonial
blow.
soldiers were
Belgium
executed
surrendered
even after
on May
surrendering.
28th.
German
Unilaterally,
officers often
King
justified their
Leopold
actions
III,
with vile
without
racial
consulting the
ideology.
Allies, gave
One
himself
German
up to the
commander
Germans
told a French
and became their
officer,
prisoner.
"An
The
inferior
Allies
race
were
does not
stunned.
deserve to
French
fight
Premier
such a
Paul
civilizing
Reynaud called him a
race as
pig.
the German race."
Former British Prime Minister
In
David
Wagram,
Lloyd George called his
Erquinvillers,
actions
and Le
a
Quesnoy,
sample of perfidy
massacres
and
of prisoners and
pusillanimity.
civilians
But even
occurred.
with Dunkirk,
At times,
the war in
French
France
women
wasn't
and children
over.
were
It was
executed
about to get
alongside
worse.
soldiers.
With
The
North
Wehrmacht
cleared,
looked the
the
other way.
Germans turned their attention
The
to Case
narrative
Red,
of a clean
the
blitzkrieg
conquest
was
of the
already
rest of
forming.
France.
But for the
On
victims,
June 5th,
it was
they attacked.
genocide by another
This time,
name.
there would be no
As the
evacuation.
military front collapsed,
Army Group
the
B
political
advanced
crisis
toward
in
the
Paris
Seine.
reached its breaking
Army
point.
Group A, with most
Premier
of the
Paul
panzers,
Reynaud desperately
smashed through
sought
toward
options.
Tours and the Loire River.
He requested more
Army
British
Group
fighter
C
squadrons,
assaulted
but
the
got
Maginot
only
Line,
4.
finally engaged
He asked
after
President
being bypassed in
Roosevelt
the
for
opening
aid
weeks.
and received sympathy,
France had no
but
time
no
to
material
regroup.
support.
No reserves.
He proposed a
No
union
answer
of
to the
France
speed
and
and
Britain,
aggression
a
of the
shared
German
citizenship
offensive.
and war cabinet, to continue the fight. The
The
response
world
from the
watched
French
in
cabinet
stunned
was hostile.
silence. France,
Marshal Philippe
the military
Pétain,
giant of
the
Europe,
aged World War
victor
I
of the
hero,
First World
called
War,
it a
guardian
marriage
of
with a
continental
corpse.
order,
He saw
had
the
fallen in
proposal
6
as a
weeks.
British ploy to seize
46
French
days
colonies.
from invasion to armistice.
He wasn't alone.
The implications were
The
staggering.
government fractured.
Britain stood
On
alone,
June 16,
facing the full
Reynaud
weight
resigned.
of the Nazi war
Pétain
machine.
took his place and
The United
immediately
States,
sought an
still
armistice
neutral,
with Germany.
began to reconsider
On
its
June
assumptions
22,
about global security.
1940,
The Soviet Union,
France signed an
momentarily aligned
armistice
with
with Germany in the
took
very
note of
same
the
railway
Wehrmacht's
carriage at
capabilities
Compiègne,
and
where
its
Germany had
vulnerabilities.
surrendered in
In Germany, the
1918.
victory sparked euphoria.
Hitler
The
sat
Nazi regime
stone-faced as
trumpeted
General
the
Wilhelm
campaign as a
Keitel read the
triumph of
terms.
German genius and will.
France would be
Hitler's
divided,
prestige soared to
two-thirds
unprecedented
occupied by
heights.
Germany,
Generals who
the
had
remainder
questioned him
controlled by
now
the new
stood in
Vichy
awe,
regime
or
under
fear.
Pétain, who
The
would collaborate
blitzkrieg,
with the
as
Nazis.
an idea and a myth,
Over
was
2
born.
million French
But
soldiers
it
were
was a
taken
dangerous
prisoner.
illusion.
30,000
Behind the speed and
civilians were
spectacle
dead.
were deeper
France
truths.
had lost
The
not
German
only
plan
the
had
war,
involved
but its
enormous
soul.
risk. The flanks
world
of the
watched
panzer
in
thrusts
stunned
were
silence.
exposed for days.
France,
Ammunition
the
ran
military giant of
dangerously
Europe,
low.
victor of the
In
First
many
World
areas,
War,
French
guardian of
resistance had been
continental order,
unexpectedly
had
fierce.
fallen in 6 weeks.
The Luftwaffe had
46
suffered
days from
serious
invasion
losses,
to armistice.
and their ability to sustain
The
long-term
implications were
operations
staggering.
was in question.
Britain stood
German
alone,
supply
facing the
lines
full
were
weight of the
overstretched,
Nazi war machine.
dependent on horse-drawn
The
logistics.
United States, still
And
neutral,
most importantly,
began to
France
reconsider
had
its
not been
assumptions
defeated by
about
might
global
alone,
security.
but by
The
misjudgment,
Soviet
disunity,
Union, momentarily
and despair.
aligned with
In
Germany,
the months and
took
years
note
that
of the
followed,
Wehrmacht's
a bitter
capabilities
debate
and
consumed
its
France
vulnerabilities.
and the wider world.
In Germany,
Who was
the
to
victory
blame?
sparked euphoria.
General Gamelin, the
The
commander-in-chief,
Nazi regime trumpeted the
blamed the
campaign
cowardice
as a
of his
triumph
troops.
of German genius
Marshal
and will.
Pétain,
Hitler's
now head
prestige
of the
soared
Vichy
to
regime,
unprecedented
said the
heights.
French people
Generals
had
who had
lost the
questioned
will
him
to
now
fight.
stood in awe or fear.
Charles de Gaulle,
The
a
blitzkrieg,
relatively
as an
unknown
idea
general at
and
the
a
time,
myth, was born.
argued that the army had
But
been
it was
misused,
a dangerous
dispersed,
illusion.
and outmaneuvered
Behind
by
the
a faster,
speed and
more
spectacle were
concentrated
deeper
enemy.
truths.
Marc Bloch,
The
a
German plan
respected
had involved
historian and
enormous
soldier,
risk.
who later
The flanks
joined
of the
the
panzer
resistance,
thrusts were
wrote a
exposed for
powerful
days.
book titled
Ammunition
The
ran
Strange Defeat.
dangerously low. In
He
many
pointed
areas,
to the
French
incompetence of
resistance
the
had
high
been
command,
unexpectedly
the
fierce.
ossification of military
The
doctrine,
Luftwaffe had suffered
and the
serious
failure to
losses,
understand
and their
modern
ability
war.
to sustain
The
long-term
truth lay
operations
not
was
in
in
one
question.
factor, but
German
many.
supply lines were overstretched,
Outdated
dependent
strategy.
on horse-drawn logistics.
French generals planned for a
And most
repeat of
importantly,
1914,
France had
a
not been
long
defeated
war
by
of
might
attrition.
alone, but by
They failed to
misjudgment,
grasp the revolution
disunity,
in
and
mobile
despair.
warfare, poor
In the
intelligence
months and years that
communication.
followed, a bitter
The
debate
French High
consumed
Command
France
operated
and the
with
wider world.
fragmented, slow-moving
Who
channels.
was to blame?
They were often
General
unaware of
Gamelin,
what was
the
happening on the front,
commander-in-chief,
or
blamed the
responded far
cowardice
too
of his
late.
troops.
No strategic
Marshal
reserve.
Pétain, now head
Unlike
of the
the
Vichy
Germans,
regime,
who
said the
kept
French
panzer
people had
divisions
lost the
ready
will
to
to
exploit
fight.
breakthroughs.
Charles
the
de
French
Gaulle,
committed
a
their best
relatively
units up
unknown
front,
general
with
at the
no
time,
depth.
argued that the army had been
Over-reliance on
misused,
static defenses.
dispersed, and
The
outmaneuvered
Maginot
by a
Line,
faster,
while
more
formidable,
concentrated
did
enemy.
not extend along the
Mark
Ardennes
Bloch,
or
a
protect the
respected
north.
historian and
The
soldier
Germans
who later
simply
joined the
went around
resistance,
it.
wrote a powerful book titled The
Psychological
Strange
collapse.
Defeat. He pointed to the
Even before the
incompetence of the
campaign
High
began,
Command, the
defeatism plagued
ossification
French
of military
society.
doctrine,
Many
and the
soldiers
failure
believed
to
the war was
understand
England's
modern
fight.
war.
Some
The
resented the
truth lay
Republic.
not in one
Others
factor,
feared
but many.
communist unrest. The
Outdated
will to
strategy.
resist fractured under pressure.
French generals planned for a repeat of
Air power misjudged. The Germans
1914,
used
a long
aircraft
war of
tactically
attrition.
to
They
smash
failed to
fixed
grasp
defenses,
the revolution in
disrupt
mobile warfare.
communications, and demoralize
Poor
troops.
intelligence and communication.
The French and British
The French
used theirs
High
more
Command
defensively
operated
and
with
reactively.
fragmented, slow-moving
German
channels.
aggression
They
and
were often
adaptability.
unaware of what was
The
happening
German
on the
command
front
structure
or
allowed
responded
for
far too
initiative
late.
at lower levels.
No strategic
Officers
reserve.
like Rommel and Guderian
Unlike
acted
the
boldly,
Germans, who kept
sometimes
panzer
disobeying
divisions
orders
ready
to
to
keep
exploit
momentum.
breakthroughs, the French committed their
superiors
best
tolerated
units
this,
up front
even
with no
celebrated
depth.
it, because it brought
Over-reliance
results.
on static
the fall
defenses.
of France sent shockwaves
The
through the
Maginot
world.
Line,
In
while
America,
formidable,
isolationists
did not
lost
extend along
ground
the
to those
Ardennes or
advocating
protect the
preparedness.
north. The
President
Germans
Franklin
simply
D.
went
Roosevelt
around it.
began expanding military
Psychological
production and aid
collapse.
to Britain.
Even
In
before
Britain,
the campaign
Churchill's
began,
resolve hardened.
defeatism
He
plagued
declared,
French society.
"We shall fight
Many
on the
soldiers
beaches.
believed
We
the
shall
war
never
was
surrender."
England's fight.
In
Some
Germany,
resented the
Hitler
Republic.
believed himself
Others feared
invincible.
communist unrest.
He dismissed those who warned
The will
against
to
war
resist
with the
fractured
Soviet
under
Union.
pressure.
If France
Air
could
power
fall in
misjudged.
6 weeks, why not Russia
The Germans
in 6
used
months?
aircraft tactically
But Hitler
to smash
misunderstood
fixed
his own
defenses,
victory.
disrupt
He thought it was
communications,
the
and
product of German
demoralize
racial
troops.
superiority,
The French and
of
British
destiny,
used theirs more
of
defensively
infallible
and
leadership.
reactively.
He failed
German
to see
aggression
that France
and
had not been
adaptability.
crushed by force alone.
The German
It had
command
been
structure
undermined
allowed
from
for
within.
initiative at lower levels.
And what Germany
Officers
had
like
achieved
Rommel
through
and
speed
Guderian
and surprise,
acted boldly,
it could not
sometimes
achieve again
disobeying
against
orders to
enemies
keep
who had now
momentum.
learned the lesson.
Their
In the
superiors
summer of
tolerated
1940,
this, even
as
celebrated
German
it
troops
because it brought
paraded down the
results.
Champs-Élysées,
The fall
few
of
could
France
imagine
sent
that just
shockwaves
5
through
years
the world.
later, France would
In
be
America,
liberated.
isolationists
And
lost
Nazi
ground to
Germany
those
reduced
advocating
to rubble.
preparedness.
The
President
same men
Franklin
who
D.
had driven
Roosevelt
through the
began
Ardennes
expanding
would
military
be dead or
production
in
and aid to
captivity.
Britain.
The same
In
generals
Britain,
who claimed
Churchill's
genius would
resolve
be on
hardened.
trial
He
or in
declared,
disgrace.
"We shall
The
fight
Reich
on
that
the
had
beaches.
celebrated its
We shall
swift
never
conquest
surrender."
would be dismembered.
In Germany,
Because
Hitler
sometimes
believed himself
victory is the
invincible.
beginning of
He
defeat.
dismissed those who
And
warned
sometimes
against war
the
with
fall
the
of one
Soviet
empire
Union.
teaches the
If
rest
France
of the
could
world
fall
how
in
to
6
rise again.
weeks, why not Russia in
This
6
was the fall
months?
of France.
But
And its
Hitler
echoes
misunderstood
still
his
rumble
own
through
victory.
history. If you found
He
this
thought it
story
was the
compelling,
product of German
subscribe
racial
to Legacy
superiority,
Files for more
of destiny,
cinematic
of
journeys
infallible
through the turning
leadership.
points that shaped our
He
world.
failed to see that France had not
History
been
isn't
crushed
just
by
a
force
list of
alone.
dates,
It had
it's a
been
living
undermined
memory.
from within.
And the past,
And what Germany
when
had
told
achieved through
honestly,
speed and
still has
surprise,
something to teach us
it could
today.
not achieve again against enemies who had now learned the lesson. In the summer of 1940, as German troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées, few could imagine that just 5 years later, France would be liberated and Nazi Germany reduced to rubble. The same men who had driven through the Ardennes would be dead or in captivity. The same generals who claimed genius would be on trial or in disgrace. The Reich that had celebrated its swift conquest would be dismembered. Because sometimes victory is the beginning of defeat. And sometimes the fall of one empire teaches the rest of the world how to rise again. This was the fall of France, and its echoes still rumble through history. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to Legacy Files for more cinematic journeys through the turning points that shaped our world. History isn't just a list of dates, it's a living memory. And the past, when told honestly, still has something to teach us today.